brief, but extremely important introductory chapter that you should definitely read. The authors of this textbook know about introductory chapters. We've read them ourselves. We know that the typical introduction provides very general, if not vague, information about the scope and organization of the textbook, as well as a concise and yet boring and somewhat intimidating introduction to a course or even a field of study. Since the typical textbook is large and expensive, introductory chapters, if they are brief, seem totally unsuited to their purpose, since it is difficult to imagine a useful introduction to, for example, the accumulation of knowledge about basic chemistry that only runs a few pages. On the other hand, if the introductory chapter is too long, it may make you feel as if the authors and/or editors are getting paid by the page. You won't feel that way with this introduction. Each section, paragraph, and sentence here has been painstakingly, lovingly, and artisanally crafted to ensure only the most productive response in you, our reader. The lengths of the chapter's various discursive elements have been field tested at a number of diverse sites, following both time-tested and contemporary empirical methods. In short, we are confident that when those congratulatory blurbs that often appear on the backs or even fronts of books eventually show up on this one, they will focus so much approbation on this introduction that there will be little space left to praise the rest of the book, even though it is equally praiseworthy. So please do read on. We certainly hope and expect you will be fully oriented by the end of the next few pages, ready to start an intense semester of rhetoric and writing, two activities that the U could not do without. Definitions rhetoric may be defined as the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. Aristotle, Rhetoric 1. Rhetoric is the use of language as a symbolic means of inducing cooperation in beings who by nature respond to symbols. Kenneth Burke, A Rhetoric of Motives 43. Figure 1, Cicero, Denounces Catiline by Cesare Uncari. This book is about rhetoric and writing, both of which are common subjects a lot of college students are required to learn about. Rhetoric. You already know a lot about rhetoric. You already intuitively understand that you change the way you communicate through language, gesture, clothing, and maybe even body art if you can comfortably change that quickly, depending on the situation and the people around you. When you tell family members and friends who are not at the U about your experiences here, you will probably choose different topics, words, and tones for your grandmother than you will for your former high school classmate. This textbook will help you try to add to what you already know and help make you more conscious of a range of your rhetorical decisions. So far, you've spent the bulk of your time as a human communicating with others, largely by means that you've developed by a process of acquisition. In other words, rather than being explicitly taught effective rhetoric, you've acquired rhetorical practices through trial and error, much as you learned your first language by listening and observing, then trying a word or two, then more words, then sentences, then longer stretches. You knew the first time that you said a bad word in front of your parents, for instance, that something had gone wrong, even if you didn't necessarily have a way of articulating what that was. This course will teach you rhetoric through a much more explicit learning process. You will learn to refine what you've already acquired, and you will also, crucially, learn a vocabulary to describe what you're learning. Acquisition and learning go hand in hand. You don't need to know theories and terms to use rhetoric on a daily basis, but if you do learn them, you can be more conscious of what you're doing, and you can be better at analyzing how other people use it. The word rhetoric has been around since it emerged in ancient Greece. However, as you can see from the quotations that start this chapter, there is no single best dictionary definition of rhetoric that adequately describes what it is. In fact, definitions of rhetoric have been contested since they were first created. For the purposes of this book, though, the best working definition of rhetoric is a pretty contemporary one that clearly borrows a lot from 20th century rhetorician Kenneth Burke. Rhetoric is the study and use of symbolic resources, especially language, that help humans cooperate with one another. Notice that the definition doesn't include the word persuasion. That's not because rhetoric doesn't involve persuading other people. It's because persuasion is only part of what rhetoric is about. Persuasion can frequently be helpful and productive. Efforts to reduce smoking in recent years have no doubt improved public health, for example. But part of the reason rhetoric has gotten such a bad reputation is that most people think rhetoric is a way to use language in manipulative, if not deceptive ways to change people's minds or get them to do things they wouldn't ordinarily do. That does happen, of course, in political campaigns, ad campaigns, and even more mundane day-to-day conversations. But it's only a small part of what rhetoric is capable of helping people do. Rhetoric can help people create shared senses of values or challenge other values. It can signify group membership for the purposes of including some people and excluding others. It can combine language's functions, entertaining at the same time it informs. As you experienced if you read the beginning of this chapter and you're still reading, rhetoric can also involve sarcastic and overblown language that just maybe nudges readers into reading further to see what else the authors might do. Writing, especially writing to argue now, writing. You probably already know a lot about writing too, since it's very likely that you had to write to pass end-of-grade tests in high school or to complete standardized college entrance exams. We hope you had many other opportunities to write in school too, from academic essays to research and lab reports to short stories to poetry. Whether you've done a lot of writing in school or not, it's even more likely that you write frequently as you send email messages and text messages, send tweets, post to Facebook, or communicate on the job. Unlike rhetoric, though, writing isn't as easily acquired. Rhetoric can work through speech, gesture, and other language modes that don't involve writing figure 2 image by David Falconer at all, so you were using rhetoric almost as early as you were making noise and flailing around. Writing, though, is usually learned formally, and often in school. So you haven't been writing as long as you've used rhetoric. Since opinions differ widely about how best to teach writing, and since students in colleges and universities come from increasingly diverse language and educational backgrounds, your own writing education may have been inconsistent. For most of rhetoric's history, writing has provided writers a way to make notes or even scripts for themselves that they would then speak from. In other words, writing has traditionally played a supporting role to speech. But over the last couple of hundred years, writing has become a more and more important rhetorical technology, especially in colleges and universities. Writing is a key component of education in virtually any major academic and professional disciplines largely define themselves through writing, since writing provides an excellent way for communities that are not all in the same place to identify who they are to themselves and to one another. In this book, we'll help you use writing specifically to analyze, create, or, in rhetorical terms, invent and revise arguments. At first glance, you might think there's no real need to boldface that word, since you've been arguing for a long time, and you know what arguing is about. But we want to be very clear about what we mean by argument. It's not a verbal fight. It's not just taking contrary positions to show off or to compete. It's not the yelling you see and hear on some news talk shows in which the winner is apparently the loudest person or the one with the last word before a commercial break. Argument in this course involves analyzing issues, taking positions on them, backing up those positions with reasons and evidence, and being explicit about the assumptions you make. Argument is a process in which people who might disagree about a controversial issue make their positions as clear and explicit as possible so they can understand each other's reasons, evidence, and assumptions. In very big picture terms, we think that's what a university level education is for, slowing down the rapid circulation of information so we can understand what's actually being said and what's actually at stake. Sometimes an argument leads to a change of mind, but sometimes it doesn't. Either way, what argument should ideally do is help all parties understand more about the issue being discussed and why different people can come to different positions about it. While this book is not strictly about academic writing, we obviously know that's probably the kind of writing you're most preoccupied with right now. We can't predict, and maybe you can't either, what your major will be. So there's no way to teach you everything you need to know about how to write in the university in one course. But what we can do is expose you to a range of strategies that should serve you well, regardless what your major is. The most important strategy is to learn how to write, since the context for the writing you do will continue to change through different classes and beyond. If you're reading this paragraph and thinking you've already picked, or are planning to pick, a major that doesn't require much writing, you're probably wrong. Take engineering, for instance. Several credible scholarly studies show that professional engineers spend 40 to 90% of their time on the job writing. Sorry for the bad news. We hope you can use your engineering. Another word from the Greeks. But the root word of technology, techne, doesn't refer only to the devices most people mean when they use that word. So stop texting your friend and pay attention. Techne broadly refers to the informed practice of an art or craft. In short, it means something like applied knowledge. Smartphones definitely involve the application of knowledge, but so do paper, pens, and rhetoric. Degree to make lemonade out of those lemons. A first example. This is all fine, and you'll have time to see the specifics of what it all means, but maybe the best way for you to begin to understand what rhetoric is to launch into seeing how it works in a written example. This is a petition created by John Lauer of Denver and posted to change.org, a website that hosts and promotes a wide variety of petitions. Lauer's appeal concerns healthcare for hotshots, firefighters who specialize in dry season wildfires. It's likely that you've received appeals very similar to this one. Maybe you've acted on them, maybe you've disregarded them. As you read this one, think less about whether you agree or disagree with Lauer's position, and think more about the strategies he seems to be using to get his point across. In other words, analyze. Right now, wildfires are raging in New Mexico, Colorado, and Arizona. And more are sure to come. I'm a part of a hotshot crew of firefighters. We are on call to go anywhere, at any time, to fight fires in our country. It's intense work, but my crew is like my family, and we are all committed to serving our communities. Because wildfire is more common from May to October, most of us are seasonally employed. More than 90% of us return year after year, and we often work the equivalent of a full year in 6 to 7 months. Despite this, and despite putting our lives on the line every day, we still don't have the opportunity to buy into a government healthcare plan, even at the most basic level. This is because we are classified as temporary workers. I have been a wildland firefighter for 6 years, and I still don't have health insurance. But I'm one of the lucky ones. Just in my own hotshot crew, I've seen the damage and suffering this lack of coverage can produce. My godson, Rudy, was born prematurely. Rudy's dad, a fellow firefighter, was stuck with $70,000 worth of hospital bills that he and his wife couldn't pay back, all because the federal government won't allow him to access health insurance. Another crew member's child, who was born even more recently, required special attention in the hospital, and his parents are now facing $40,000 in medical bills. Wildland firefighters face enormous risks in order to serve and protect our communities. In the past 12 years, 179 wildland firefighters have been killed in the line of duty, and the conditions of the firefighting environment have been linked to cancer and permanent lung damage. We want federal legislation that gives us that option, but we know that Congress can be slow-moving. That's why we are asking President Obama to extend health coverage benefits to seasonal wildland firefighters. Baby Rudy doesn't deserve to be born into debt. His father is a hero. It's a brief introduction. On the website, the petition is followed by a link to a signature page that adds the name of the user to a letter that change.org plans to send to the president. What strategies do you see? Here's a start. Lauer starts by referring to the urgency of the problem that makes the hotshots important in the first place. Right now, he writes, wildfires are raging. As you'll learn, Lauer is employing the rhetorical strategy of kairos, which is a Greek term that roughly translates to timeliness or opportunity. Right now, he means, firefighters are putting themselves on the line to protect lives and property, so we should do something right now. Near the middle of the appeal, Lauer writes a paragraph that's just one sentence long. This is because we are classified as temporary workers. The extreme brevity of that paragraph makes the paragraph look unusual. Most of us grow up with the idea that paragraphs should be quite a bit longer. He seems to want to use the brevity to emphasize the point. There's a sharp contrast between the long and hard hours hotshots put in, which he just described, and their temporary status. Lauer doesn't rely on an appeal based on his own experience. He enlists the experiences of fellow hotshots who have families, including small children. Without taking anything at all away from the experiences of these children and their parents, it's worth noting how often children appear in appeals similar to this one. At this point, it's probably worth posing a question a lot of students of rhetoric eventually ask. How do we really know that a rhetorical strategy we see is one that the rhetor intended? The short answer is we don't. The longer answer is that rhetoric isn't solely a function of what a rhetor intends to do. Rhetoric works because rhetors and their audiences co-construct meaning. Both contribute. Frequently, writing teachers, ourselves included, reinforce the message that it's the writer's responsibility to be as clear as possible so that the audience has to do as little work as possible. It's definitely a good goal to be clear, but on the way to that goal, you should remember that there is always noise, there is always the possibility of complex understandings and even misunderstandings, and there's ultimately very little you can do about it. Yes, there are strategies that help you fit messages to audiences, but audiences are, after all, humans just like writers are, and they have their own agendas, preferences, and thought processes. This book will teach you about time-tested patterns and strategies, but as time-tested as many of them are, they are not guarantees that your message will come across perfectly. Another way to think about that principle is to realize that when we analyze the rhetoric of a petition or a magazine article or research report or ad or film, we're not cheating by reading into the rhetoric. If we as an audience see or hear something that appears to be a pattern, and the pattern is affecting our understanding in some way, then it really is there whether the writer intended it or not. In such a moment, we're co-creating the rhetoric. For example, maybe Lauer didn't really think through the rhetorical import of writing paragraphs that were only a sentence long. But we think they're effective on the page for precisely the reasons we listed above. What's important in this course is learning how to point out and analyze the specifics of how an example of rhetoric is affecting your understanding so you can be a better consumer and producer of rhetoric. There, we told you it would be brief and useful. To do: 1. Use whatever source you would like to find one additional definition of. Rhetoric. Be prepared to discuss its similarities to and differences from the 3 definitions we offered earlier. 2. Identify and analyze 3 more strategies you believe contribute to the persuasive appeal of John Lauer's petition. Don't worry about using specific rhetorical terms, since you probably don't know them yet anyway. Just try to put into words, like we did, what you're seeing and how you think it might affect your response or the response of someone else. 3. Imagine that you work for change.org and that you are responsible for writing. Rhetor is a general term we'll use throughout the book to describe someone who is using rhetoric. A lot of the time, the rhetor in our examples will be a writer or author, which is what you will be too as you write in your rhetoric course. But we prefer the term rhetor because it gets around having to use one of those awkward / words like writer, speaker, when we may want to talk about what rhetors do in multiple modes of language, including speech, writing, and electronic communication. A cover note that your organization will send to the White House along with 20,000 signatures on Lauer's petition. Write the note, limiting yourself to 250 words. As you write, try to pay attention to how you, yourself, are using strategies to tie Lauer's emotional introduction to the large number of signatures.